Production of food is something that more and more of us are paying attention to. What goes into our bodies for nourishment is something that goes beyond a simple dietary fad. It's become the height of importance that the food we consume is safe and grown in a way that doesn't poison our environment or even our bodies. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and on Truthout interviews with me is Truthout writer Mike Ludwig. He's one of the staff writers, and he went to Hawaii to write an article about the battle over the regulation of GMOs in Hawaii. Hey, Mike. Welcome back to Truthout.
Hey, how you doing, Ted?
I'm doing all right. Now, first off, I kind of alluded to it in my introduction, but maybe you could tell our viewers exactly what GMOs are.
GMOs that's an acronym for genetically modified organisms, which are also known as genetically engineered organisms. But what I was specifically been reporting on in Hawaii and also for years is genetically engineered crops. These are crops that the genetic codes inside of the plants have been altered, or maybe other genes have been replaced or inserted into the seeds of these plants that allow them maybe to have higher yields, to be resistant to pests or to pesticides. And they're very popular, especially in the United States. You know, over 90% of our corn and soy now is genetically engineered.
How much? 90%?
Yeah, over 90% of the corn and soy grown in the United States is genetically engineered at this point. Mostly to be resistant to herbicide. So that way you could spray herbicide over your entire field instead of having to apply it in little spots where the weeds actually are, kill all the weeds. But the plants that you want, the genetically engineered plants that are resistant, won't die.
And the idea is to create a higher yield of crop. Therefore, you increase your profit margin.
Right, yeah. I think large farming operations really, especially large corn and soy that are making stock feed, making seeds to sell to other people, they've definitely, the kind of industrial agriculture business has really invested in this technology, which, was pioneered by, DuPont, Monsanto, BASF, and Syngenta, these big biotech agrochemical companies that develop the chemicals that go right with these, that pair right with these genetically engineered crops.
One of the things that I picked up on in your article that you wrote for Truthout is the amount of pesticides that are used in the production of these genetically modified organisms. It's more than what would be used in, say, more conventional farming or non-GMO farming, if that's even all at all possible nowadays, because you said about 90% of soy and corn is genetically modified. But why so much? Why are they using so many pesticides?
The industry claims that they're genetically engineering crops so you can actually use less pesticides or use them more efficiently. And they say that's one of their goals of genetic engineering. And it's possible that because of genetic engineering, less of the really harmful pesticides that were used in agriculture 15, 20, 30 years ago that ended up being phased out are being used. But a study that was done in 2009, known as the Benbrook study, showed that since the introduction of genetically engineered crops into the American farm business, that the amount of herbicide and pesticides used by American farmers has increased steadily. Now in Hawaii, where I was reporting from, these aren't farms that are producing crops. They're producing crop seed, and they're also experimenting with genetically engineered seeds. So they're crossbreeding, they're cross-pollinating, they're doing open-air trials of experimental different seeds. And they're seed farms, so they're not producing food, they're producing seed to be planted somewhere else. And because these are not considered food products, they're not actually growing corn to eat or corn to feed animals. They're just growing corn to get the seed or to experiment and develop the different seed varieties. Because they're doing that, they're allowed under state and federal law to use much more pesticide and herbicide. So that's the big concern, especially on the island of Kauai, in Hawaii, is that they're using a large amount of pesticide in these trials and in these seed development plots, and these test farms and GMO experimental plots. Some of them are right next to neighborhoods, and people are worried that they could be getting sick or that their environment could be impacted.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would think that if these laboratories, if you will, aren't essentially under a regulation to control the amount of pesticides that are used. And because it's experimental and they're trying to figure out how resistant would these GMOs be to pesticides, so we're really going to dump a lot on them to see how they react. That's going to go into the environment at some level, whether into the groundwater, whether into the air. And how that affects the local population is of a paramount concern. And you did chronicle a few instances where people were getting sick.
Sure, and doctors there say they've seen a spike in birth defects. There's people who suspect their illnesses that they have could be tied to these chemicals. I mean, this is an area that has been was used to be plantations, used to be sugarcane plantations, which also used a lot of pesticide and herbicide. And because it's been farmed for so long, there's this kind of like dusty red soil on that part of the island. And since most of the natural ground cover has been removed and replaced with cover crops, or just removed in general, or these crops are harvested and churned up and taken down for more things to be planted, that has allowed this dust to get picked up in the wind. It's allowed to be eroded by the wind, and it regularly blows onto people's houses. There was one woman who testified in front of the county council saying that she cleans it from her sheets and her family is sick. Now, when it comes to pesticides, what it's all about is pathways to exposure. Are there pesticides in this red dust that's blowing in the wind that's from the ground where these farms have been? And is it making people sick? Are the pesticides running off into the irrigation canals that run literally right through the fields, right through the neighborhoods, and then right into the pristine ocean where there's a reef that fishermen say is dying? Research has to be done to prove that link, because the companies are going to say, listen, we've followed the labels on these pesticides, we have trained people applying them, we're following the rules, so there's no reason to be concerned. But they're also not releasing very much information about how much they use. Very little is actually known about how much they use, which chemicals they use. That had to be actually dragged out of state record and out of their records through lawsuits and through information requests from public officials, because they weren't giving the community very much information about this. And that is the information that doctors need to know, researchers need to know, in order to say, hey, we do have a problem here.
During these lawsuits to try to essentially discover what kind of chemicals are in the soil or in the runoff water, have any groups actually done any tests at this point to determine what those chemical compounds are?
People had to go to the state, and they said, hey, state of Hawaii, what information do you have on these chemical sprays? Now, I called the Department of Agriculture there, and they said, well, these applicators, these pesticide applicators, now, the companies we're talking about here are the biggest names in agrochemical in the world. We're talking Syngenta, BASF, DuPont Pioneer, and Dow Agrochemical, okay? And they have to keep records for 2 years when they use restricted use pesticides. They don't have to hand them over to the state unless an inspector shows up to do an investigation. So the state doesn't actually have these records. What they do have a record of is how much chemicals they purchased and what the names of those chemicals are, how they're used, if they're stacked together, when and where they're sprayed. That it remains completely unclear.
How would the state intervene in terms of an inspection? What would be the process by which you engage the state in saying, look, we think something's fishy is going on here? Would it be citizens or residents basically complaining to the state government about that?
Sure. Well, there was a number of occasions a few years ago, a middle school in Waimea, which is a community that's kind of ground zero for alleged pesticide exposure on Kauai. Kids started getting sick, and there were noxious odors, and they had to be sent to the hospital. And many teachers suspected that it was pesticides from Syngenta. So there was an investigation. Years later, they found trace amounts of different pesticides used in the area inside the school, but they also found trace amounts of this stinkweed, a local noxious plant that Syngenta said actually caused the problems. In this community, there isn't a lot of data because it's hard to compare it to what the companies are doing. No one knows which pesticide they're spraying and where. And as far as state investigations, I talked to a county councilman from Kauai who asked the state for all their records of the investigations of these countries. And yeah, he got about 150 investigations and violations back, but 72 of them were redacted because they were ongoing and had very little information there. He asked twice to get those redactions removed. They said they couldn't do it. Later, it was discovered that there was only one inspector coming to these areas, and that the inspectors in the Department of Agriculture had a backlog a mile long that they hadn't addressed yet. So yeah, the state is behind in Hawaii as far as inspecting these things goes, and that is why on that island they got together, activists and concerned residents of that community got together to pass a Bill 2491, which would require these companies to disclose when and where and which pesticides are spraying and how much. It would also require an environmental impact analysis of pesticide use in the area, and it would get the research going to find out, is there a link between these alleged health problems and the pesticides in their area. And you'd think that if the companies are saying what they're doing is safe, the study and disclosure would just prove that, yeah, they're not harming anybody. But they fought this bill tooth and nail. They rallied their workers against it. They framed it as something that was anti-farmer, anti-agriculture, and it really was a very divisive issue on the island.
Well, if there's health concerns, there's certainly going to be liability if this bill gets passed, and I'm sure there may be a liability clause that's built into it.
There's criminal and civil penalties if they don't comply with the law. But what would happen is it would make it easier if the information did come out, if researchers could link people's health problems to pesticides, then yeah, it would open up floodgates for lawsuits, things like that. I mean, DuPont Pioneer is already being sued by 150 residents of this community because of the red dust and for diminishing property values. But even in that lawsuit, they can't claim health impacts because there isn't enough information to make that link.
These tests that are being done in Kauai right now could easily, if they work, could easily be used on farms here in the mainland of the United States. And so those health problems could certainly leapfrog into other communities.
Right. I don't know if it would be as intense of pesticide use in just regular farms in the United States, but we have to, think about the big picture about this kind of agriculture. These companies are in the business of chemical-heavy, petroleum-heavy, genetically engineered, high biotechnology agriculture. And that is really the debate that's kind of raging right now, is industrial agriculture that is basically based around patents that are held by multi-billion-dollar international corporations. Is that the way we want to feed our world in the future? Do we want to be worried about people being sprayed with pesticides if they live near farms for years and years to come? I mean, in California, the EPA is fighting off a lawsuit because a group of people got together and said, hey, according to our research, people of color and Hispanic people that live in these areas are much more susceptible to be exposed to pesticides, and you need to do something about it. The EPA tried to do something about it and did an environmental justice initiative, and they're saying it's still a problem, that they haven't gone far enough, so they've taken the EPA back to court. So this is a problem on the mainland, and it's a problem and debate that's going to be floating around agriculture for as long as these kind of products and growing techniques exist.
All right, Mike. Well, I want to thank you again for being on Truthout Interviews.
Thanks again, Ted.
Mike Ludwig, he's a writer for Truthout. You can read his article called On the Front Lines of Hawaii's GMO War. And that's Truthout Interviews for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.